The house was enveloped in silence, shadows creeping into every nook as Leah crept down the hallway toward her nephew Kyle's room. Her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. She was acutely aware that this was wrong, yet the anticipation of her next move only intensified her longing. The undeniable attraction that had developed between them was palpable. Each shared glance and accidental brush of skin had created an unbearable tension. Tonight, she resolved to give in to it. With a gentle push, she opened the door, holding her breath as she peeked inside. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting delicate shadows across the bed where Kyle lay. He appeared serene, sprawled comfortably on his back, one arm casually resting above his head, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Leah's gaze lingered on him, her heart racing as she absorbed every detail, the strong contours of his shoulders, the way his shirt hugged his form, and the subtle stubble along his jawline. Biting her lip, she fought the instinct to retreat, but a deeper, primal urge kept her rooted in place. Her eyes traced the outline of his body beneath the sheets, and a wave of heat washed over her. There was no turning back now. Quietly, she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She paused at the foot of the bed, simply watching him for a moment before carefully climbing onto the mattress. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she settled beside him, leaning in closer, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered his name, Kyle. He stirred slightly, tilting his head in her direction, yet remained asleep. Leah's heart raced wildly at the sight of him, completely oblivious to her presence, sending a delightful shiver down her spine. She lowered herself further, her lips just a breath away from his cheek, and placed a delicate kiss on his skin. He murmured softly in his slumber, his lips parting as if instinctively responding to her touch, causing Leah's breath to catch in her throat. With a gentle caress, she trailed her lips along his jawline, her kisses becoming bolder as she ventured down to his neck. The warmth of his skin beneath her lips and the faint scent of him made her head spin. Unable to resist, she slid her hand up his chest, her fingers teasingly tracing the contours of his muscles. He shifted slightly, his brow furrowing, yet he remained asleep. Encouraged, Leah leaned in closer, her body pressing lightly against his as she kissed the side of his neck, her tongue flicking out to taste him. The sensation made him shudder, his breathing catching, and she smiled against his skin. Kyle, she whispered, her voice a sultry murmur, wake up. His eyes fluttered open slowly, still clouded with sleep, and he blinked up at her, confusion flickering in his gaze as he tried to comprehend the moment. Leah? He murmured, his voice thick and groggy. What are you? But before he could finish, she silenced him with a kiss, soft and tender at first, then deepening into something more demanding. Kyle stiffened, his eyes widening in surprise, but Leah didn't pull away. She felt his body respond to her, sensing his hesitation fade as his lips began to move against hers. She whispered softly, breaking the kiss just enough to murmur against his lips, her hands gliding up to cradle his face. Just let me, just this once. Kyle let out a low, helpless groan, his hands instinctively gripping her waist as if he were powerless to resist. Leah took this as her signal to deepen the kiss, pouring all her pent-up longing into it. His defenses crumbled, and suddenly his hands were everywhere, tracing up her back, tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as he kissed her back with an equal fervor. Leah's heart raced as she felt him shift beneath her, his body arching to meet hers. The heat of him against her made her gasp softly, and she couldn't help but grind against him, her movements slow, sensual. Kyle's grip on her hips tightened, a desperate sound escaping his lips as he buried his face in her neck, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Aunt Leah, we shouldn't, he murmured, his voice strained, but his words faded as she kissed him again, her tongue slipping past his lips to dance with his. He groaned, his hands sliding down to her thighs, and Leah shivered as his touch sent electric jolts through her. Don't think, she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. Just feel. Then she kissed him again, her hands exploring his body as if she were trying to memorize every inch of him. She felt him shudder beneath her, responding to her touch, which only made her bolder. Slowly, she slipped her hand beneath his shirt, her fingers trailing over his bare skin. Kyle let out a soft, helpless moan as he whispered Leah's name, his voice strained yet filled with longing. Instead of pushing her away, his hands began to explore her body, tracing her curves with a tentative touch that soon grew bolder when he sensed her willingness. Leah arched into him, her breath escaping in soft, breathless gasps as his fingers glided up her sides, lightly brushing against her ribs. The sensation of his touch sent her head spinning, and she leaned down, her lips trailing over his collarbone, her tongue teasingly tasting his skin. Kyle's grip on her waist tightened, his body quivering beneath her, and Leah found herself unable to resist pressing closer, her hips moving in a slow, sensual rhythm against his. "Aunt Leah, please," he groaned, his voice laced with desperation, leaving her uncertain whether he was pleading for her to stop or to continue. All she knew was that she couldn't pull away now, not when he felt so incredible beneath her, not when she could sense his body responding to her every move. Leah slowly kissed her way back to his mouth, her hands gliding over his chest as she deepened the kiss, pouring her passion into it. Kyle moaned into her mouth, his hands roaming over her body, sending shivers down her spine. This was undeniably wrong, so very wrong, but in that moment, none of that mattered. All that counted was the way he made her feel. Leah's heart raced uncontrollably as she felt Kyle's lips part beneath hers, his initial resistance melting away. His hands explored her back, slipping under her shirt and grazing her skin, causing her to gasp softly into his mouth. She deepened the kiss, her tongue dancing with his as she pressed her body closer, feeling the warmth radiate through the thin fabric of his clothes. She could sense his uncertainty, the slight tremor in his fingers as they traced her curves. Yet, every time he attempted to pull away, even for a moment, Leah captured his lips again, kissing him with increasing intensity until he was left breathless and quivering beneath her. The taste of him was utterly intoxicating, igniting a wild need within her that she couldn't suppress. Her hands wandered, sliding down to the hem of his shirt and lifting it, revealing the smooth skin of his abdomen. "Kyle," she murmured against his lips, her voice low and sultry. "I've wanted this for so long." He shuddered, his breath hitching as Leah leaned down, her lips trailing along his neck. She felt his pulse quicken beneath her mouth, sensed the tension in his body as her hands roamed over him, caressing every inch of bare skin she could find. He was so warm, so strong, and the sensation of him made her head spin. "Aunt Leah, we can't," he whispered, his voice strained. But the way his hands tightened around her waist and how his body arched against hers told a different tale. He didn't truly want her to stop. "Don't fight it," she whispered back, her lips brushing against his. Leah let herself be swept away in the moment, kissing him again as her hands glided up his chest, pushing his shirt higher. He raised his arms, allowing her to pull it off completely. She tossed the shirt aside, her gaze darkening as she took in his physique, broad shoulders, defined muscles, and skin that shimmered softly in the moonlight. He was stunning, every inch of him, and she couldn't help but lean down, her lips grazing his collarbone before trailing lower, kissing her way down his chest. Kyle let out a groan, his fingers tangling in her hair as she continued to kiss him, his body quaking under her touch. Leah smiled against his skin, her tongue teasing the contours of his muscles, relishing the way he responded to her every caress. She kissed lower, her hands gliding over his sides, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath her fingertips. "Leah, please," he murmured, his voice a breathless plea, but she didn't relent. She made her way back up, her hands exploring his chest and shoulders before sliding down to his hips as she straddled him, their bodies pressing together in a way that made them both gasp. "Does this feel wrong?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. She rocked her hips against him, the slow, sensual movement eliciting a soft groan from him. "Yes, I mean no. I don't know," he stammered, his hands gripping her waist, torn between pulling her closer and pushing her away. Just let go, Kyle, Leah murmured softly. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a deep, lingering kiss that ignited a fire within them. Her hands glided up to cradle his face, and with each kiss, the passion intensified, each one more fervent and urgent than the last. Kyle's resolve shattered completely as he responded with an equal hunger, his hands moving up her back to draw her nearer. He rolled them over, pinning her beneath him, and Leah's heart raced as she met his gaze, his eyes dark with an unfamiliar desire. "Aunt Leah, I can't stop," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "Then don't," she whispered, her fingers tangling in his hair. "Don't stop." In an instant, he was kissing her again, his mouth demanding and warm against hers, his hands roaming over her body, exploring every inch as if he were desperate to know her completely. Leah arched beneath him, trembling as his hands traveled down to her thighs, lifting her skirt and brushing his fingers lightly over her bare skin. "Kyle," she gasped softly, gripping his shoulders as he kissed a path down her neck, his lips trailing over her collarbone and lower. The heat of his body pressed against hers was almost overwhelming, each touch and kiss sending electric jolts through her, making her head spin. "I want you," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands sliding down his back to pull him even closer. "I want you so much." Kyle groaned, his grip tightening on her thighs as he kissed her again, his mouth insistent and fervent against hers. The tension between them was palpable.